Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Alexis Tippmann, and I am an MSW. I am a counselor here at Corazon Holistic Health. And excuse me, this month, as the educational event, are not doing it in person, and instead I'm doing this recording to give you guys some information about menstruation and how it affects our neurodiversities. Um, excuse me. So I'm excited. I hope that you learned something from this. Um, Attached to the email that you get with this recording is going to be some research that I use to gather information, as well as some additional like tools and supports to help guide you or your children who menstruate through the difficulties of menstruation when it comes to how it affects our neurodiversity. I will say I am not an expert on this topic. The research that has come out about this particular topic has been recent. And so there are still a lot of questions that need answered as well. There's a lot of things that we don't know, but we do know there's a correlation somewhere between some of the things that we struggle with during our menses and our neurodiverse qualities. And so the objective of this informational recording is to give you a little bit of information as well as some things that you can do to actively um, engage and use different tools to help you navigate through some of the things that you may struggle with because of this. Um, yeah, so I'll be going over a little bit about like the basics of how the menstrual cycle works. I'll also be talking about how hormonal changes affect women with ADHD and how it can help, or it can help. It can create like ADHD and autistic traits to appear stronger or to be felt stronger. Um, and then I'll be talking about some like practical tools that you can use or that you maybe would, if you have a loved one or a child who may benefit from, that maybe they could use to support them. Yeah, so I want to go over like basics of what neurodiversity is first, and what I mean by that, um, or what is meant by that. And so when we are talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about brains who work differently than like the so-called average brain or normal brain as described in psychology. So this includes like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, um, obsessive compulsive disorders there, BPD. There's a wide range of bipolar of um, terms and labels that kind of fall under this umbrella. Excuse me. But today we are mainly going to just focus on ADHD and autism because these are the two conditions that have been researched, um, and there is support that hormone changes throughout the cycle affect the traits or symptoms experienced by ADHD in those with autism or those who are autistic. Uh, and so another thing too is that one thing that comes up consistently in research, and you guys probably know this, if you don't, welcome. Uh, those who are assigned female at birth tend to be underdiagnosed or underrepresented in research. And this has been going on for decades. And the stereotype, for example, of like ADHD is this boy who is like bouncing off the walls, um, or autism is like has been seen through this lens of like it's this boy who has social challenges. And we are finding that it is much more than that, right? And those who are assigned female at birth are have a harder time getting diagnosed because may be experiencing like masking of their symptoms. So you may hear me use the term masking through this recording. And if you want to know a little bit about masking and what that may look like for you, if you haven't read it yet, is it going to show? Maybe camera. Here you go. This book is called Unmasking Autism by Dr. Devin Price. And there's a really good tidbit in here about masking and what that looks like and what it does to our nervous systems, if you're ever interested about that. Because it can be an exhausting experience if that's what you are, if you are going through. But masking really to its core is it's when we hide our natural behaviors to try to act like something that seems more appropriate in the eyes of other people or for certain situations, like socially acceptable things, right? And so, for example, someone who has autism might push themselves to make more eye contact, even if it makes them feel uncomfortable and it causes like energy drain to do so. Or someone with ADHD might use every amount of energy that they have, every brain cell, to stay organized or to look organized, even though on the inside their brains are all busy, right? So it takes a lot of energy. That's exhausting, and this can lead to burnout, right? It increases stress, mental health struggles. Um, it's exhausting. It's tiring to go through this. To to be masking all the time, it's a very tiring thing. Um, and why it matters today is because with the hormonal changes in the menstrual cycle, it can make masking even harder to do and more exhausting, right? So for like, this is kind of getting into the roots of it, but just as an example, when we're on our cycle and our estrogen drops after we ovulate, our dopamine also goes down. And when that happens, if we have ADHD, you'll see like sensory sensitivity spiking. And it can make that masking feel almost impossible to do, you know, when we have like sensory insensitivity, or when we're more sensitive to like sensory input, when we're overstimulated, we're going to feel, well, I mean, we could feel multiple different ways, right? Like we can shut down and hide and run away, or we just need a lot of like internal time where we need to go like hide in our bedrooms and just shut everything out. Or it can also look like anger and irritability because you have all these things happening all the time, right? And so can you think of a time like in your menstrual cycle where you feel more sensitive to the sensory input in your life, whether it's like lights or sounds or sounds, noise, or when people ask you too many questions at once, or you have too many chores you need to do, or your list just seems really long. That's sensory input, you know? So, do you relate to that? I'm curious. Yeah, and so, yep, I already talked about that. Okay. And it is important to talk about, I mentioned already like estrogen and dopamine. Well, the main hormones in your menstrual cycle are estrogen and progesterone, right? They have really powerful effects on your brain, especially dopamine and serotonin, which are like our feel good neurotransmitters, our feel good juices inside of our brains. And dopamine is tied to a regulation and emotional and sensory regulation. And it does make sense that when, you've got estrogen and progesterone dipping and rising throughout the menstrual cycle, that we would see changes in estrogen and serotonin that affect these things that neurodiverse people struggle with, or traits that they have, right? So let's go ahead and just back way up, right? Let's talk about the menstrual cycle. What just basics menstrual cycle. What are the phases, right? Um, and we're going to break it down in four. There are four main phases. Some research actually suggests there being like 5 or 6 possible phases because of how the hormones look, but we're going to keep it simple. Feel free to look into that if you are interested. One of the research articles that will be linked to this video does talk about that. So if you scroll through that, or if you have any questions, let us know. We're happy to answer those. But typically, a cycle will range anywhere between like 21 and 35 days. Now, that is for like a typical like regulated cycle. Some women experience menstrual cycles that are like 40, 50 days long or longer than that, because of hormonal struggles that they may be having internally. But everyone's cycle is unique to them. And so if you have any concerns about that, please talk to your doctor about it, or one of us, and we can help guide you in the direction that you may need to go for it. But anyway, phase 1 of the menstrual cycle is called the menstrual phase. This is when the bleeding happens. This is when your hormone levels are the lowest. So your progesterone levels and your estrogen levels are the lowest. Your energy, you probably don't have a lot. Your emotions may dip. You may be in pain. You might have cramps, and you're probably tired. So that's the first part of the menstruation. And then after the bleeding stops, you move into your follicular phase. And this is what happens. This comes right after your period. Your estrogen starts to rise. So you may notice that you feel more energetic, more social. You may notice you being more creative. Your concentration may be improving, and your mood often lifts during this phase because as estrogen rises, so does your dopamine and your serotonin. They happen to be linked a little bit. The third phase is the ovulation phase. This is when we release an egg from the ovum, and this usually happens around the middle of the cycle. It's different for everybody. And this is when estrogen is at its highest. And so this tends to be when people feel the most attractive and confident, and outgoing. We're very social during this time. The last phase, which is about the last 2 weeks of your cycle, it's usually about 14 days. It can range depending on the person, but it's usually pretty consistent. And this is the time between when you ovulate and your next period, when you bleed. And during this period, progesterone rises. And for many people, did I write it down? What it said? Let me see. I don't remember, but I think in one of the research articles that I post, it mentions that about 40% of women who are autistic struggle with PMS, premenstrual symptoms. PMS, premenstrual symptoms. I think that's what it is, or PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And these show up during the luteal phase. And this is where we see like irritability and brain fog, cravings, like food cravings. Maybe you want more carbs, more sugar. Some women will crave like beef during this time, or like irony things. So you might notice some sleep changes, mood swings. And for people who have ADHD or autism, the symptoms of like attention deficits or attention difficulties show up. Sensory overload is going to be a lot more sensitive during this time. and your emotional sensitivity may be stronger here. So you may notice in your luteal phase that your emotions are a little bit harder to regulate. How do you relate to that? Have you ever noticed that before? That leading up to your cycle, um, leading up to when you start bleeding, that you notice some of these changes where you are more sensitive, or maybe like your daily tasks are harder to do. You know, maybe you struggle with like remembering to put your laundry in the dryer, or tasks at work become a lot harder to manage. How do you relate to that? Do you notice anything like any of those changes? Uh, yeah, so that's the luteal phase, right? So when as estrogen drops after ovulation, progesterone rises, right? And so progesterone is also linked to an increase of cortisol levels, which is our stress hormones. So that is where we see like an increase of inflammation in the body near the end of the menstrual cycle, which also affects mood too. And if you have PCOS, that it, that it affects the insulin sensitivity that you may have, um, which would increase the cravings that you would have of like carbs, carbohydrates, breads, and sugar, or potatoes, for example. Um, yeah, and so dopamine and serotonin, which are our feel good juices in our brain, are depleted, they're lessened. So we're going to have an effect on our emotional regulation, or like anything that has to do with the front of our brains right here. Is going to be a little bit harder to do. So thinking logically, or managing emotions, or everyday tasks, maybe you struggle with planning. Whereas just a couple of weeks ago in your follicular phase, you're creative and expressive, and you're able to plan, and you have all this energy. Well, all of a sudden you ovulate and all that goes away, or you notice depletions in it. Do you relate to that? Is that what your experience is like? I will say that in one of the research articles that will be linked at the end of this, they do talk about how some women, it's actually ovulation that causes that to happen, not in the luteal phase is usually okay. So there is evidence that says that it's possible that there are some women who actually struggle during the middle of their cycle. The luteal phase is pretty normal. So that's something that you may notice too, that there are changes there with your neurodiversity. Okay. I'm curious about that, if you relate to any of that. All right. So a lot of this I've mentioned briefly already. But the next topic or section that we're going to talk about is how hormones interact with neurodivergent traits, right? Like struggling to focus, or forgetting things, or feeling unmotivated, stuck, overwhelmed, struggle like difficulties with socializing, those kinds of things. So with estrogen, right? So this is the hormone that increases during the follicular phase, and then it's at its peak when we're in the ovulation phase, and then after ovulation, it drops during the luteal phase, right? So that's estrogen. Um, and we know that estrogen helps boost the dopamine in our brain. And dopamine is the chemical in our brains, the feel good juice in our brains that helps us with focus and motivation and reward. Please excuse me. And so when estrogen is high, people who have ADHD and struggle with their ADHD symptoms sometimes may notice that those symptoms are much lighter during that time of their menstrual cycle, during that follicular phase and the ovulation phase, because naturally in their bodies, their dopamine levels are higher. And they are able to concentrate a little bit better and organize and get things done. However, on the flip side, right, when we get to the luteal phase, they may notice a reverse in the ability to do those things. Yeah, and so right before your period and that luteal phase with ADHD, when you have that dopamine deficiency already with that disorder, that yeah, that disorder, that or neurotype with that neurotype. I don't like the word disorder. There's nothing wrong with you. Please forgive me. But when there's dopamine irregularities in the brain already with ADHD, and then we look at the menstrual cycle and notice that naturally, as those who are assigned female at birth have estrogen drops in the luteal phase, their dopamines drop in too. And so there's going to be some extra struggle there with your ADHD symptoms, however they show up, or your ADHD traits, right? And so with progesterone and estrogen shifts in autistic individuals, this is where they see like heightened sensory sensitivity and emotional dysregulation to like loud noises and bright lights or the texture of their clothes. All of these things could just all of a sudden feel way more overwhelming than they usually do. And sometimes even like social interactions that might have felt manageable the week before no longer feel manageable and are increasingly unbearable during this time of the month, sometimes with women who have autistic women. I do have it on here. Research, the suggestion or statistically shows that 1 in 5 women who are autistic experience premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is that decrease in mood or shifts in mood right before your period cycles, right before that menstrual phase. And that's severe, whereas this is only occurring in 1 in 30 women who are neurotypical. That's a big difference. 1 in 5 and 1 in 30. That's a lot more women who have autistic traits that are struggling with this disorder that neurotypical women do not. And it is a huge difference. And it tells us that the menstrual cycle has a stronger impact. Those hormonal shifts have a stronger impact on neurodivergent brains. So give yourself some compassion during that time. If you've ever like compared yourself to other women in your life who are neurotypical and their cycles don't affect them just as much as it's affecting you, that is normal, right? With these changes in hormones throughout the month and how they're affecting the symptoms that you experience every day, that's hard. So give yourself some compassion there. So if you've ever wondered, like, why do my ADHD symptoms or my autistic traits flare up right before my period? Or why do I feel like I suddenly can't cope with noise or touch? It's not in your head. It's biology. Research supports that. Yeah, so take that in a little bit, right? So I want to take a moment here and just acknowledge the lived experience behind these facts that we are suggested in research, right? One study that will be linked in here too looked at like the most common responses to when asking women about their periods. And the most common response that they got was that life is much more difficult to manage during periods. So maybe you resonate with that, right? Like we have said, you are more anxious during that time, or you have this sense of like losing control, or that masking, pretending to be okay, just seems impossible. And for many people, this is true, right? 1 in 5 autistic women, the week before their period, it's like they're trying to hold everything together. And there are these 100 spinning plates happening, and every single plate just keeps dropping. That alone is overwhelming. And, like all that noise, No thanks. That sounds like a nightmare to me. I don't know about you. Yeah. So to be clear, this these experiences that you may be having, if you resonate with any of this, they're very valid. Um, and the science they're out there right now is just trying to get caught up um, to the things that those who fall under the neurodivergent umbrella have been expressing for years as part of their experience. Okay. So again, I didn't even think about this. I wrote it down. I forgot to mention this. Um, so how are some other ways that some of these uh, challenges may show up in your life, right? Um, so I've talked about sensory overload as a big one, and something to bring up or even consider during this time is like the texture of like pads and tampons can be overwhelming. Um, the feeling of cramps could be overstimulating as well, or even like the smell or feel of the blood can be unbearable for women who are, well, I mean, ADHD, sometimes women with ADHD and autism, they both have sensory, they can have sensory input um, differences to neurotypical people. And so those are some challenges that you may notice that you experience too, which if you're overstimulated, you know, again, we've talked about the mood swings and the irritability that may come from that. What kinds of things do you notice when you are overstimulated or um, your sensory input is too much? What kinds of things show up for you? What kind of feelings or ways do you act out? Um, do you struggle with those things, like the texture of your clothes or your pads or your tampons, and how do you manage that? Um, yeah, and so during this time of your cycle, it can really feel like you have these like sensory input and this emotional input is colliding into like the storm of like emotional overwhelm inside your head and in your bodies. Um, so if you've ever noticed yourself like snapping at loved ones or you're crying and you don't know why, this is, yeah, it's part of it. It makes sense to have those struggles um, with the shifts in the hormones in your body during the month. Okay. So what do we do about it? You know, if you're still here with me, um, listening to this little TED Talk podcast that I've done for you, um, and you're wondering like, what do I do now? How do I what do I do with this information? Um, well, research is still catching up, but some of the things that you can do right now is start trying to cycle sync your life. What this means is finding and noticing the patterns that you and your body have throughout the month and adjusting your routines and your expectations to match where you are in your cycle at any given time. And so this is where like cycle tracking comes in. Everybody's cycle is different. You know, you may start tracking your cycle and notice that it's 45 days long and you notice you have signs of ovulation around like the 28th day or something like that, right? And that might be different to someone else who has a 28-day cycle and they notice their ovulation happening around day 14, you know? Um, so when we're cycle tracking, you know, there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. There are um, charts out there and that you can print off in case you're concerned about using an app on your phone, which isn't also another thing, like another way to track your menstrual cycle is to use an app. There are many of them. Um, and you want to look at the different types of symptoms that happen throughout the month. How are you feeling, you know, day to day? What is contributing to that? you know? If your mood is low, why? What happened there? Like, was there a trigger? Is it because you're in your luteal phase? What's happening there? Were you overstimulated, right? Did you notice any physical symptoms? During our luteal phase, a lot of times women experience like breast tenderness or nausea, even closer to their menstrual phase, right? Um, and so, by tracking these symptoms and throughout the length of your menstrual cycle, you can start to see patterns on what is happening, what is going on. When are you feeling overwhelmed or irritable, or you can't stand it when then your dog's nails clack on the floor, or whatever it is, you know? Or maybe you notice like sometimes of the month you really love rock music, but then other times of the month you can't stand it. When what are the patterns? Are there patterns? That's what tracking is for, is to kind of see that. Um, and so when we use these, when we track our cycles, we can see and start to plan our most demanding work or social activities in your follicular phase, where your energy and your focus are usually higher because of that increased level of dopamine and serotonin, and your estrogen levels are high, right? Um, and so you can start to plan things around that, and your ovulation too, around that week or in your fertile window. You can lean into like creation and confidence. And this might be a really good time, for example, for like job interviews or creative projects, presentations, like this, for example. Um, and then when you go into your luteal phase, right before your period, those 2 weeks, you can lower some of the expectations that you have and build in more rest in your routine, right? Simplify your schedule a little bit more. I don't know if you know this, but something that some of my clients have found very helpful is realizing that a neurotypical person can hold 3 tasks that they have not built into their routine and their mind a day without feeling overwhelmed. So outside of like repetitive routine behaviors, they're able to hold 3 things. Any more than that, and they notice increase in stress levels. And that's a neurotypical brain. What does that look like for you? How many added tasks are you able to hold in a day outside of your like routine behaviors before you start feeling overwhelmed, right? Maybe lower that during your luteal phase. And focus on maintenance of things instead of trying to reach really big. Well, the big goal here would be to take care of yourself, but like instead of like big goal things that you may be able to be more efficient in working on during your follicular or ovulation phase of your cycle, right? And then during our menstrual phase, when we are bleeding, you can kind of prioritize recovery and light movement to relax your muscles and bring like a sense of peace and relaxation into your body. Lean into some of those comfort foods and recognize that self-care is not an indulgence, it's necessary, and to take care of yourself during that time. And so by tracking your cycle, you can kind of look at these patterns that you might have and try to sync your life around it to give yourself a little bit of compassion and relief during times that you may not be able to build the world, you know? But then build the world when you're in the time that you can do that. So think about that. What would that look like for you if that's something that you would want to try? Would it be helpful or not? And so I didn't do a whole lot of research on this part, but another thing that could help too is try to find like neurodivergent friendly like menstrual products. If you do notice that you're overwhelmed by the sensation or of having tampons or pads. Some of the suggestions that I thought up were like trying to find softer fabrics for your underwear, or breathable pads, like different types of pads feel differently. Maybe trying to use like period underwear or reusable cups or whatever reduces some of that sensory distress. Because during that time, you're already in sensory overwhelm. Let's limit that for your body, for you. And so, yeah, so think about that. Accommodate yourself. You deserve that. You work really hard. Yeah. Some other ways, if you want to think a little bit bigger, when we look at like workplace or academic supports, a lot of times policies about menstruation don't consider neurodivergent needs, and sometimes those accommodations can feel inaccessible or impossible if you struggle with this sensory overwhelm or the fatigue of it. And so some flexible things that could be done when it comes to work or like academic, like school, is to be able to work from home, like have that option during your luteal phase or your menstrual phase. Maybe look at possibly having some flexible deadlines during that time, or lighter workloads during your luteal phase. Another thing too is consider like inclusive language, where not everybody experiences PMS the same way, right? It's different for everybody. Even here, I've talked about some of the symptoms that you may experience or how your cycles may look different. It is different for everybody. Even research supports that, whereas some people, the mood drops during a luteal phase, like mid to late. But some people, it's early luteal phase within the first couple of days. And so it's different for everybody. So avoid those assumptions and be compassionate to yourself and to other people. And also, another accommodation too you could think about is trying to incorporate like masking breaks throughout the day. And this would be like chances for those who menstruate, who have ADHD or are autistic, can step away for a little bit at work or at school to come down a little bit from that sensory overload without being penalized in any way. Just allow them to like take that breath that they need from masking. And these things are not luxuries. They're accommodations. And when used appropriately, they can improve performance and reduce burnout. It helps everybody, not just neurodivergent people, right? So, yeah, I hope that you found this a little bit helpful. I love your feedback. If you wanted to email Sophia and let her know if you learned anything or had any questions, or you thought maybe this part was more helpful than others, or maybe you want to learn more information, or you're like, this was a ridiculous topic to cover. I'd love to hear that, what your thoughts are of what I talked about today. Briefly, as I wrap up, I want to leave you with a few resources that you can explore, and they will be in the email that comes with this recording. So we find them helpful, but the first resource I want to mention, it's called Planet Puberty. This is a non-for-profit. This is the non-for-profit one, yes. So this is a digital resource. It's a website. And the purpose of this website is to help those who menstruate navigate puberty and menstruation, who have autism or intellectual disabilities. A book that I found, if you're interested, for some of the adolescents or children that you may have, It's, well, maybe some of the adults may benefit from it too. I don't know. I haven't read it. Maybe I should. But the book is called The Autism Friendly Guide to Periods, and it is reported to be practical and easy to read. The Another resource I have here, let me see, what else do I have? So I talked about Planet Puberty. Okay. And along with it, you'll get the citations for the research articles that I used in the creation of this, as well as a couple of like blog posts that you could click on and read if you're interested. One of them is from a doctor on LinkedIn who talks about neurodiversity in women with ADHD and menstruation. And then the other one is from the Autism Awareness Center. And it talks about hygiene, and it's an autism-friendly guide to periods. So if you're interested in those. Oh, another thing too, Planet Puberty also has free workshops for parents and children, as well as podcasts and other services. So I definitely recommend, if you're interested in any of that, or to see what all they may have to offer. Puberty and being a teenager is a hard time already. And then throw in neurodiversity in that. That's a difficult period of life to be in. So if any of those supports are helpful, we would also love to hear about those. If you noticed that this particular website or book that you found was helpful, I'd love to hear about that. Let me know, or Sophia. I'd love your feedback. Thank you for listening to me yap during this time. I'm sure I've been here for a little bit. How did you like this version of an educational event? Do you have any feedback about that? If anything, I look forward to hearing from you or seeing you. It's a pleasure, as always. Okay, well, I'm going to go. Thank you so much for listening to me today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, let us know. All right, much love to you guys. Okay, bye-bye.